Ambassador Alara Vance walked through the golden halls of the Concorde station with her head held high and her heart beating fast inside her chest. The station was massive beyond human imagination. A spinning ring of metal and crystal that floated at the center of known space where 12 great species had met for 10,000 years to decide the fate of civilizations. She had trained her whole life for this moment, and she would not let fear show on her face no matter how much her hands wanted to shake. The doors ahead of her were carved from a single piece of black stone, and they were older than human civilization itself when they opened with a deep rumbling sound. Alara stepped into the chamber of voices and felt the weight of 100 alien eyes upon her. The chamber was circular and vast, with seats rising in tiers around the central platform where she now stood alone. Above her sat the representatives of the Concorde of 12, the ruling body that controlled trade and war and peace across 1,000 star systems. She recognized them from years of study. The insect-like Croth, who communicated through clicking sounds and chemical signals. The beautiful and cold Synthera, who had evolved to live in the vacuum of space. The ancient tree beings called the Vorin, whose single representative was older than most human nations, and there at the highest seat sat High Sovereign Catharan of the Velith Dominion, a massive reptilian creature whose scales were the color of dried blood and whose yellow eyes watched her with obvious contempt. The Velith were the oldest of the 12 species, and they had ruled their corner of the galaxy for 50,000 years before humans had learned to make fire. Alara knew that. Catharan hated humanity with every fiber of his being. He saw humans as vermin that had somehow crawled out of the mud and into the stars, and he had opposed their membership in the Concorde since the day they first made contact. Ambassador Vance of Earth, the speaker announced, its voice echoing through the chamber. You may present your petition. Alara took a deep breath and began to speak. Honored members of the Concorde, I come before you today to request that humanity be granted full membership in this ancient body. She paused and looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes as she could. For 60 years, Earth has held provisional status in the Concorde, and for 60 years we have proven ourselves worthy of your trust. She activated her holographic display, and images appeared in the air around her. Human ships carrying food to famine-stricken worlds. Human doctors treating plague victims on distant colonies. Human engineers building bridges and roads on planets that had never known such things. We have contributed to every relief effort. We have honored every treaty. And we have never once raised weapons against another Concorde species. The Krath representative clicked something that her translator rendered as approval, and several other species nodded or made similar gestures, but Catharan simply watched with those cold yellow eyes, and his silence was more frightening than any words could be. Humanity asks only for the chance to stand as equals among you, Alara continued, to have a voice in the decisions that affect all our peoples, and to contribute our unique strengths to the common good of the galaxy. She finished her prepared speech and stood waiting for the response that would determine the future of her entire species. The chamber was silent for a long moment, and then Catharan rose from his seat with a movement that was surprisingly graceful for a creature of his size. The human speaks of contribution, he said, his voice like rocks grinding together. But what has humanity truly contributed except chaos and violence? Alara felt her stomach drop, but kept her face calm. Your species has been in space for barely 300 years. And in that time you have fought 2 wars among yourselves that nearly destroyed your homeworld. He looked around the chamber, and Alara saw that several species were nodding in agreement. You carry aggression in your very blood, and your history is written in fire and death. Alara wanted to argue, wanted to point out that humans had also written their history in art and music and love. But she knew that interrupting a high sovereign would only hurt her cause. I move that the petition be denied, Catharan declared, and that humanity remain in provisional status for another 100 years until they prove they can control their violent nature. The vote was called, and Alara watched as species after species sided with the Velith. Some voted against humanity out of genuine fear, others because they owed debts to the Velith Dominion, and still others simply because it was easier to maintain the current order than to welcome a new voice when the count was finished. Humanity had lost by a margin of 8-4. Alara bowed her head in acceptance, as her training demanded, and said the words that were expected of her. The human delegation respects the wisdom of the Concord, and will continue to work toward earning your trust. Inside, her heart was breaking, but she would not give Catharan the satisfaction of seeing her pain. As she turned to leave the chamber, she noticed something strange. Catharan was speaking quietly with representatives from 3 other species: the Mordith, the Skarn, and the Vexari. All 4 of them were looking at her with expressions that made her blood run cold. And when Catharan caught her watching, he smiled in a way that showed all of his sharp teeth. Alara walked out of the chamber with the image of that smile burned into her mind. She contacted Earth immediately and spoke with President Chun in a secure communication channel. The petition failed, she reported. But that is not what concerns me. She described what she had seen: the secret meeting, the cold smiles, the sense that something far worse than a simple vote was being planned. President Chun listened carefully and then asked the question that Alara had been dreading. What do you think they are planning? Alara closed her eyes and spoke the truth that she had been afraid to put into words. I think they are planning to do more than just deny youth membership. And I think they are planning to send a message to any species that might think about supporting us in the future. The line was silent for a moment, and then the president spoke again. Continue the diplomatic efforts, Ambassador, but keep your eyes and ears open. Alara agreed and ended the communication, but she could not shake the feeling that diplomacy was no longer going to be enough. In the weeks that followed, she tried everything she could think of to build support for humanities, because she met with every species that had voted in their favor and tried to convince them to speak out against the Velith. She gathered evidence of human contributions to the galaxy and presented it to anyone who would listen. She even attempted to arrange a private meeting with Catharan himself, hoping that she could find some common ground. But every door she knocked on was closed in her face, and every ally she thought she had suddenly became too busy to speak with her. Something was happening behind the scenes, something that was turning the entire Concord against humanity, and Alara could not figure out what it was. She would find out soon enough, and when she did, she would realize that her worst fears had been far too optimistic. The storm was coming, and humanity stood directly in its path, armed with nothing but good intentions and a desperate hope that reason would prevail. It would not be enough. The emergency session was called without warning, and Ambassador Alara Vance had barely enough time to dress before Concord security forces arrived at her quarters to escort her to the Chamber of Voices. She knew immediately that something terrible had happened, because the guards would not look her in the eye when she entered the chamber. She found that all 12 species were already present and seated, and the air was thick with tension and anger. High Sovereign Catharan stood at the central platform where petitioners usually spoke, and his yellow eyes found her the moment she walked through the door. The human ambassador arrives at last, he announced, and his voice dripped with false concern. Perhaps she can explain the actions of her savage species? Alara felt confusion wash over her because she had no idea what he was talking about. What actions are you referring to? She asked as she made her way to the human delegation seat. Catharan gestured with one clawed hand, and a holographic image appeared in the center of the chamber. It showed a group of ships bearing human markings, and those ships were firing upon a convoy of civilian transports. The image was grainy and unclear, but there was no mistaking the human symbols on the attacking vessels. 3 days ago, human warships attacked a Velith relief convoy in the outer territories, Catharan declared, and 400 innocent lives were lost. Elara's mind raced as she tried to understand what she was seeing. The human fleet had standing orders to avoid all contact with Velith vessels, and she knew that no human captain would ever fire on civilian ships. "This must be a mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "Human vessels would never attack civilians, and I need to contact Earth to verify the location of our ships." "There is no need for verification," Catharan interrupted. "We have recovered debris from the attack site that confirms the weapons used were of human origin." He waved his hand again, and more images appeared. Twisted metal fragments, computer cores that supposedly contained human code, and weapon signatures that matched Earth's military technology. Elara stared at the evidence and knew in her heart that it was false. But she also knew that proving it would take time. She did not have. "I request an independent investigation," she declared, invoking the only protocol she could think of. "And I request that this matter be examined by a neutral party before any action is taken." The Synthera representative, a being of living crystal who had always been sympathetic to humanity, rose from her seat. "The human ambassador makes a reasonable request, and we should not rush to judgment based on evidence provided by only one party." Hope flickered in Elara's chest, but it died the moment Catharan spoke again. "The Synthera speaks of caution. But how much caution did the humans show when they murdered 400 of my people?" He turned to address the entire chamber, and his voice rose with theatrical anger. "For 60 years we have tolerated these creatures among us. And for 60 years, they have plotted and schemed and waited for their chance to strike." He pointed at Elara with one clawed finger. "This is the true face of humanity. Violent, treacherous, and incapable of peaceful existence." Elara stood her ground and spoke as calmly as she could. "The Velith evidence is circumstantial at best. And I remind this chamber that Article 7 of the Concord Charter grants any accused species the right to present counter-evidence before judgment is rendered." She looked around at the assembled representatives, searching for any sign of support. "I invoke Article 7 and demand the opportunity to defend humanity against these false accusations." The chamber fell silent, and Elara dared to hope that she had bought herself some time, but then Catharan laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls like breaking glass. "Article 7 applies only to full members of the Concord, Ambassador, and humanity holds only provisional status." He smiled that terrible smile again. "Provisional members have no such rights." Elara felt the floor drop out from beneath her as she realized the trap that had been laid. The Velith had kept humanity in provisional status for exactly this reason, so that when the time came to strike, humans would have no legal defense. "I move that humanity be expelled from the Concord, effective immediately," Catharan announced. "And I further move that all human colonies outside the Sol system be declared unprotected territories." Elara's blood ran cold at those words, because she knew exactly what unprotected meant in Concord law. Any species could attack an unprotected territory without consequence, and no other species was obligated to come to its defense. "You cannot do this," she shouted, abandoning all pretense of diplomatic calm. "You are condemning billions of innocent people to death based on evidence that has not been verified." The Krath representative clicked nervously, and several other species shifted in their seats with obvious discomfort. But no one spoke in humanity's defense. The vote was called, and Elara watched helplessly as species after species voted in favor of expulsion. Even those who had supported humanity before now voted against them. Their eyes fixed on the floor, as if ashamed of what they were doing. When the count was finished, the result was unanimous. 12 votes for expulsion. 0 against. Alara stood alone in the center of the chamber as the sentence was pronounced, and she felt the weight of 8 billion human lives pressing down on her shoulders. Catherine descended from the platform and approached her with slow, deliberate steps. "You have 24 hours to leave Concord space, Ambassador, and I suggest you use that time wisely." He leaned close to her, so close that she could smell the cold reptilian scent of his breath. "Tell your people what happens to species that challenge the natural order of things." Alara refused to flinch or look away. "History will remember this day, High Sovereign, and history will remember what you have done." Catherine laughed again and turned his back on her. "History is written by the victors. Little human, and your species will not survive long enough to write anything." Security forces escorted Alara from the chamber, and she was taken directly to her ship without being allowed to gather her belongings or say goodbye to any of her staff. As her vessel departed from Concord Station, she activated the emergency transmitter and sent a single coded message to Earth. The message contained all the evidence she had, all the suspicions she harbored, and all the warnings she could think of. It ended with 7 words that would change the course of human history. "They have chosen their path. God help them." President Chun received the message and immediately called the United Terran Parliament into emergency session. The representatives gathered within hours, their faces grim and their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what was coming. There were no speeches and no debates. Everyone in that room understood what the Concord's decision meant for humanity, and everyone knew that diplomacy had failed. The vote was unanimous and swift. Humanity would prepare for war, and humanity would show the galaxy what happened to those who threatened its survival. Fleet Admiral Marcus Chun, the president's own brother, received his orders that same night. He read them once, then read them again to make sure he understood Operation Absolute Response was authorized, and the chains that had held humanity back for 60 years were finally broken in shipyards across human space. Vessels that had been hidden for decades began to power up their engines. Soldiers who had trained in secret for a war they hoped would never come received their assignments and said goodbye to their families. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the human fleet began to gather like a storm on the horizon. Developed thought they had won. They thought humanity would submit or die. They had no idea what was coming. The morning sun rose over New Helsinki with the promise of a beautiful day ahead. Children were getting ready for school. Farmers were heading out to tend their fields, and the smell of fresh bread filled the streets of the capital city. New Helsinki was a peaceful world, an agricultural colony of 2.5 million souls who had left Earth to build a new life among the stars. They grew food that fed a dozen other human colonies, and they were proud of the simple, honest work they did. Maria Santos was pouring coffee for her husband when her daughter came running into the kitchen with fear in her eyes. "Mama, there are strange lights in the sky." Maria looked out the window and saw them. Dozens of bright points descending through the morning clouds like falling stars. For a moment she thought they might be meteors or perhaps a shuttle fleet arriving early. Then the first explosion hit the city center, and she understood that death had come to her world. The Velith Armada had arrived without warning or announcement, dropping out of faster-than-light travel directly above the planet's atmosphere. 50 warships spread across the sky like a net, and they began firing before the planetary defense grid could even activate. New Helsinki had been designed for peace, not war. Its defense systems were meant to handle pirates and asteroids, not a full military invasion. The orbital stations lasted 11 minutes before they were reduced to burning debris. The ground-based weapons lasted even less. Governor Thomas Reed tried desperately to contact Earth, to send a distress signal, to beg for help. that the Velith were jamming all communications. And his voice disappeared into static. He ordered an evacuation, knowing even as he gave the command that there was nowhere for his people to run. The ships in the spaceport were destroyed before they could launch the underground. Shelters were targeted by weapons that burrowed through solid rock, and still the bombardment continued, hour after hour. Relentless and merciless, Maria grabbed her daughter and ran for the nearest shelter. But the streets were chaos. Buildings were collapsing around them. Fires were spreading through entire neighborhoods, and the screams of the dying filled the air. She saw her neighbors crushed under falling rubble. She saw children wandering alone, crying for parents who would never answer. She saw things that no human being should ever have to witness. The shelter was already full when she arrived, but someone pulled her inside anyway, and the doors sealed behind her in the darkness underground. She held her daughter close and listened to the world ending above them. The bombardment lasted 6 hours when it finally stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. Maria waited with the others, too afraid to move, too afraid to hope, when rescue workers finally dug them out 3 days later. She emerged into a world she did not recognize. The city was gone, not damaged, not destroyed, but simply gone where buildings had stood. There were only craters filled with glass and ash. The sky was black with smoke, and the air burned her lungs with every breath of the 2.5 million people who had lived on New Helsinki. 1.8 million were dead. The survivors wandered through the ruins like ghosts, searching for loved ones they would never find. Maria's husband was among the dead. His body was never recovered. High Sovereign Catharan broadcast his message to the galaxy 12 hours after the attack ended. "Let this serve as a lesson to all who would defy the natural order," he declared, his voice cold and satisfied. Humanity brought this destruction upon themselves through their aggression and their arrogance. He paused and smiled into the camera. Other human colonies will face the same fate unless Earth agrees to submit to Velith oversight and control. And I give them 1 week to decide. The message was received on Earth with stunned silence, followed by a rage that burned hotter than any star. President Chun addressed the United Terran Parliament with tears streaming down his face and fire in his voice. "The Velith have murdered nearly 2 million of our people," he said. 2 million innocent men, women, and children who did nothing wrong except exist. He looked around the chamber at the representatives who sat in shocked silence. "They call us aggressive, but we did not start this war." His voice grew stronger, harder, filled with a fury that seemed to shake the very walls. "They call us violent, but we did not burn a peaceful world to ash." He slammed his fist on the podium. "They think they can break us with terror and death, but they do not know who they are dealing with." The chamber erupted in shouts of agreement, and the vote that followed was not even close. Humanity would not submit. Humanity would not surrender. Humanity would answer this atrocity with everything. It had Fleet Admiral Marcus Chung received the final authorization. That night, he had been preparing for this moment for 30 years. Ever since he first realized that the galaxy saw humanity as prey rather than partners. The ships under his command were not the small patrol vessels that the Concord had seen. They were weapons of terrible power, designed in secret and built in hidden shipyards. Crewed by soldiers who had trained for war, while diplomats played at peace. Operation Absolute Response had 3 objectives: destroy the Velith military capability, remove the Velith government, and make certain that no species in the galaxy ever again thought that humanity was weak. The Admiral looked at the orders one last time, then turned to his command staff. "Begin the jump sequence," he said, "and may God forgive us for what we are about to do." 300 warships activated their faster-than-light drives in perfect synchronization. Space itself seemed to tear open as the human fleet vanished from Earth's solar system. They were not heading for the border of Velith space. They were not planning a careful campaign of strategic strikes. They were going directly to the heart of the Velith Dominion, to the homeworld that had ruled that empire for 50,000 years. The Velith thought they had won. They thought humanity would cower and beg for mercy. They had forgotten, or perhaps never understood, the most important lesson of human history. When you push humanity to the brink of extinction, when you threaten everything they love, when you leave them no option but to fight or die, they fight. And they do not stop until the threat is gone forever. The storm was coming. And this time, it was humanity that would bring the fire. The Velith homeworld of Scarith had never known war for 50,000 years. The seat of the Dominion had been protected by its position deep within their territory, and by the certain knowledge that no enemy could ever reach it. Defense stations orbited the planet more out of tradition than necessity, and the fleet that patrolled its space had grown complacent from centuries. Without challenge, Admiral Verkith was enjoying his morning meal when the alarms began to sound. He dismissed them at first, assuming it was another drill or perhaps a minor technical malfunction. Then his communications officer screamed words that made no sense. Contact. Multiple contacts emerging from fold space directly above the planet. Verkith dropped his food and ran to the command center, his mind racing to understand how this was possible. The nearest human system was months away at maximum speed. No fleet could cross that distance without being detected by the hundreds of sensor stations between here and there. But when he reached the command center and saw the tactical display, he understood that everything he knew about humanity had been wrong. 300 ships hung in space above Scarith, and they were unlike anything the Velith had ever seen. The smallest of them was larger than a Velith heavy cruiser, and the largest was so massive that the sensors initially classified it as a small moon, before recognizing it as an artificial construct. How is this possible? Verkith whispered, but no one had an answer. The human fleet did not wait for the Velith to recover from their shock. The first wave of attacks hit the orbital defense stations before they could raise their shields. Weapons that the Velith did not recognize tore through metal and flesh with terrible efficiency, and station after station went dark on the tactical display. Verkith ordered his fleet to engage, but his ships moved like old men compared to the human vessels. The human fighters swarmed through space like angry insects, moving with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural. Later analysis would reveal that the pilots were linked through neural networks, their minds connected to each other and to their ships, allowing them to fight as a single organism with 100 bodies. Verkith's flagship, the Pride of Scarith, was considered the most powerful vessel in the Velith Navy. It had been built to project strength and inspire fear, and it had never lost a battle in 300 years of service. When it engaged the human fleet, it lasted exactly 4 minutes. Kinetic rounds moving at a fraction of the speed of light punched through its armor like paper energy beams, sliced its weapons arrays into useless slag. And when the ship finally began to break apart, human rescue shuttles actually moved in to save the surviving crew members. That was perhaps the most terrifying part of all. The humans were not fighting with hatred or rage. They were fighting with cold professional efficiency, destroying everything that threatened them while going out of their way to minimize civilian casualties. High Sovereign Ketharan watched the battle from his palace on the surface below, and for the first time in his long life, he felt genuine fear. The fleet he had commanded to destroy New Helsinki was gone. The stations that protected his world were gone, and still the human ships kept coming, moving into position for what he knew would be an orbital bombardment. He had ordered the same thing himself just weeks ago. He had watched with Satisfaction as a human world burned beneath Velith. Weapons. Now he understood what that felt like from the other side. And the knowledge broke something inside him. His advisors urged him to flee, to escape to a distant colony where he could rebuild and continue the fight. But Catharan knew that there was nowhere in the galaxy that humanity would not find him. The largest of the human ships, the one that had seemed like a moon, moved into position directly above the capital city. Its name was painted on its hull in letters large enough to see from the ground. TFS Nemesis Admiral Marcus Chun appeared on every screen on the planet, his face calm and his voice steady. High Sovereign Catharan. This is Fleet Admiral Marcus Chun of the Terran Federation Navy. He paused, and when he spoke again, there was ice in his words. You killed 1.8 million civilians on New Helsinki. 2 million people who never threatened you, who never raised a weapon against you, who wanted nothing more than to live their lives in peace. The Admiral's eyes seemed to burn with cold fire. You declared our world's unprotected territories. You invited the galaxy to prey upon our people. You thought you could break us with terror and fear. He leaned forward slightly. You wanted to see what humanity does without the leash of diplomacy? The pause that followed felt like an eternity. Welcome to the lesson. Catharan's hands were shaking as he reached for the communication console. I surrender, he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. I offer unconditional surrender. Stop the attack. Admiral Chun regarded him with an expression that held no anger, no hatred, and no mercy. Your surrender is accepted. High Sovereign. You will be taken into custody to face trial for crimes against humanity. He turned to give orders to his crew, then looked back at the screen. But understand this clearly. We are not here for revenge. The Admiral gestured to the tactical display behind him, showing the Velith homeworld surrounded by human warships. We could destroy your world in minutes. We have the weapons and the will to do it. He shook his head slowly. But that would make us no different from you. And humanity refuses to become the monsters you think we are. Landing craft began to descend from the human ships, carrying soldiers to secure key locations and take Velith military leaders into custody. There was no resistance, because there was no one left to resist the Velith fleet. Had been destroyed in less than 4 hours. The government had surrendered before a single weapon was fired at the Suvdi planet's surface, and now human soldiers walked through the streets of the Velith capital, not as conquerors seeking plunder, but as peacekeepers establishing order. Admiral Chun remained in orbit, coordinating the occupation with the same precision he had shown in battle. Within days, human aid ships began arriving with food and medical supplies. For the civilian population, human engineers began repairing the infrastructure that had been damaged in the fighting human. Doctors treated the wounded. Whether they were human or Velith, the galaxy watched in stunned silence as humanity demonstrated something that no species had expected. They had the power to destroy an empire that had dominated known space for 50,000 years. And they chose instead to rebuild it. They had every right to seek revenge for New Helsinki. And they chose instead to show mercy. They had proven that they were the most dangerous species in the galaxy. And in the same moment, they had proven that they were also the most compassionate. The message was clear to every species watching. Humanity could be your greatest friend or your worst nightmare. And the choice was entirely up to you. High Sovereign Catharan was taken aboard the Nemesis in chains, surrounded by the bodies of his guards who had tried to resist the human soldiers. As he was led to his cell, he passed a viewport that showed his world below. It was intact, it was unharmed, and somehow, that was the most terrifying thing of all. 6 months had passed since the fall of the Velith Dominion, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Concord of 12 was meeting again. But this time, the chamber felt different, smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer to listen. Ambassador Alara Vance walked through the golden halls with the same measured steps she had used before. But everything else about her had changed. She no longer wore the simple, diplomatic uniform of a provisional member. Now she wore the black and silver of the Terran Federation, with the medal of New Helsinki pinned above her heart. The guards at the door did not ask for her credentials. They simply stepped aside and bowed their heads as she passed. When she entered the Chamber of Voices, the representatives of 11 species rose from their seats in a gesture of respect that had never before been offered to a human. The 12th seat, where Ketharan had once sat in judgment of humanity, stood empty. The Velith Dominion still existed, but it was no longer ruled by a high sovereign. A provisional government had been established under human oversight, and the war criminals who had ordered the attack on New Helsinki were facing justice in tribunals that the entire galaxy could observe. Alara took her seat, the same seat she had occupied before, but now it was placed at the same level as the others, rather than below them. The Concord recognizes Ambassador Alara Vance of the Terran Federation, the speaker announced. Full member of this body with all rights and privileges thereto. The words should have felt like victory, but Alara knew that nearly 2 million people had died for humanity to earn them. She acknowledged the greeting with a simple nod and waited for the session to begin. The first order of business was the formal dissolution of the Purity Alignment, the secret alliance that had conspired with the Velith against humanity. The Mordith, Skarn, and Vexari representatives each rose in turn to deliver public apologies and to formally renounce any claims against human territory. Alara watched their faces carefully as they spoke and saw fear behind their diplomatic masks. They had seen what humanity could do, and they knew that their own worlds could have suffered the same fate as the Velith if they had continued down that path. But there was something else in their eyes too. Something that surprised her. It was relief. The Purity Alignment had not been held together by genuine belief in Velith superiority. It had been held together by fear of Velith power. Now that power was broken, and species that had spent centuries under the Dominion shadow were finally free to speak and act for themselves. The Synthera representative requested permission to address the chamber, and Alara leaned forward with interest. The Synthera had always been sympathetic to humanity, even when it cost them politically to do so. This body has existed for 10,000 years, the crystalline being said, a voice like music made of light. And in that time we have seen empires rise and fall. We have witnessed atrocities and miracles. We have watched species destroy themselves and lift each other up. She turned to look at Alara with eyes that sparkled like captured stars. But we have never seen anything like what humanity has done these past months. The chamber fell silent as everyone waited for her to continue. When the Velith attacked New Helsinki, every species in this room expected humanity to either submit or to seek vengeance so terrible that it would make the galaxy tremble. She paused. Instead, they did something that no one predicted. They won the war, and then they stopped. The Synthera gestured to the empty Velith seat. The Dominion is not destroyed. Its people are not enslaved. Its worlds are not burning. Her voice rose with something that sounded almost like wonder. Humanity had every right to do those things, and they chose not to. She looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives. I have lived for 3,000 years, and I have never seen a species show such restraint after suffering such provocation. Alara felt uncomfortable with the praise, because she knew that the decision to show mercy had not been easy. There had been voices in the Terran Parliament calling for the complete destruction of the Velith. Voices that demanded blood in exchange for blood. Admiral Chun himself had admitted in private that part of him wanted to watch Scarith burned the way New Helsinki had burned, but humanity had chosen a different path. And that choice had changed everything. The craft representative clicked something that her translator rendered as a question. The human ambassador is silent. Does she have nothing to say about her species' actions? Ilara rose from her seat and looked around the chamber at the faces of species who had feared her people, despised her people, and ultimately underestimated her people. I will say only this, she began. Humanity did not come to the stars seeking conquest or dominion. She thought of her parents, who had been among the first generation born in space, who had taught her to see the galaxy as a place of wonder rather than fear. We came because we wanted to learn, to grow, to meet other forms of life and share in the infinite diversity of the universe. Her voice hardened slightly, but we also came with a promise that we made to ourselves after we nearly destroyed our own world with our wars and our hatred. She met the eyes of every representative in turn. We promised that we would never again allow ourselves to be victims, that we would never stand by while innocent people suffered, that we would build the power to protect everything we love. Ilara paused and let the silence stretch before continuing. The Velith saw our diplomacy and thought we were weak. They saw our patience and thought we were afraid. They saw our kindness and thought we were prey. She shook her head slowly. They were wrong about all of it. The chamber was utterly still as she spoke her final words. Humanity will be a friend to any species that deals with us honestly and fairly. We will trade with you. We will help you in times of need. And we will stand beside you against any threat. Her voice dropped to something that was almost a whisper, but carried to every corner of the room. But if you threaten our people, if you harm our children, if you think that our mercy is weakness, then you will discover what the Velith discovered. She smiled, and there was no warmth in it. You will discover that humanity is the most terrifying force this galaxy has ever known. The session ended shortly after, and Ilara found herself walking through the golden halls once more. But now diplomats from a dozen species approached her with offers of friendship and trade, with invitations to cultural exchanges and scientific collaborations. They had learned the lesson that the Velith had paid so dearly to teach in the years that followed. Humanity became one of the most influential species in the Concord. They led humanitarian missions to worlds devastated by natural disasters. They mediated disputes between species that had been enemies for centuries. They shared their technology freely and asked only for friendship in return. And whenever a new species was discovered, whenever first contact was made with a civilization that had never seen the stars, the other species of the Concord would give them the same warning. Be careful with the humans. They would say, they are kind and generous, and they will help you in ways you cannot imagine. Then they would pause and add the words that had become a proverb across the galaxy, but never mistake their kindness for weakness, and never, ever threaten their children. The saying spread from world to world, from species to species, until every civilization in known space knew it by heart. Humans will forgive you almost anything. Make sure that almost does not include you. Ambassador Ilara Vance served the Terran Federation for another 40 years. And in all that time, no species ever again made the mistake of thinking humanity was weak. The galaxy had learned its lesson, and humanity had found its place among the stars, not as conquerors, not as prey, but as something far more powerful. They had become the guardians of peace, armed with terrible weapons they hoped never to use again, offering friendship to all who wanted it and destruction to all who threatened what they loved. And in the end, that was exactly what humanity had always wanted to be, not feared, but respected, not hated, but understood, not alone, but part of something greater than themselves. The stars belonged to everyone now, and humanity would make sure it stayed that way forever.